biodiversity, then we'll take the energy question, then food and farming, then housing, and then transport. And we'll have the spokesperson from each breakout group ask the question. You may want to come up here and ask it with the microphone so everyone can hear you. So if you're comfortable to do that, feel free. And then I'm going to try and do a complicated thing to make it fair by calling on the candidates in turn, but not in the same order, so everyone gets a chance to go first. But just take it from me, I'm sure it will be fine, and I'll call on you each in turn when it's your time to speak. And as before, each of the candidates will have a strict 2 minutes to respond to the question that is asked, and we'll have no heckling, no muttering, and no bad behaviour, and we'll look... Thank you. Super. All right. So we're starting with the question on biodiversity. So who in the room has the biodiversity question? Yes, over there. All right. If you're confident to amplify your own voice, we'd love to hear your question. Thank you.
Do you accept that biodiversity has decreased by a lot more than 50%, and that this poses an existential threat to humanity and all life on Earth? What policies can your party propose to reverse this catastrophe, with a specific reference to Swansea's geography?
Fantastic question. Right, first up then to answer that question is Torsten Bell from the Labour Party. Torsten.
Thank you very much indeed. Have you gone? No. There you go. That was just me saying thank you. So thanks for the question. I think the starting point in this area, I don't know the answer on, is honestly on the 50%. But the starting point is that what we do know is that we, and actually all the nations of the UK, are way off target in terms of the biodiversity targets we're committed to, the global targets. I think the Welsh Government is very clear about that. So this is starting with the depressing news. I'm going to come on to some slightly more positive news in a second. That's why they've committed to having a new government body and having some statutory targets rather than just signing up to international ones, which, if we're honest, we are way off target in terms of meeting. To be a bit more positive in terms of a framework of how we think about it, I do think there is something to be learned, not actually just across the UK, but across Europe, from the progress with the well-being of future generations as a different way of thinking about what a government is for. And I've seen in person in meetings with the Welsh Government that it does change how decisions are taken. It's not just a tick box exercise. So the question is, can we turn that into practice when it comes to biodiversity? In terms of what those all means for us in Swansea, obviously there's some very big decisions we're going to be making about the future of our local economy. The tidal lagoon is obviously high up that list, which lots of people will want to see that happen. I hope we do see that happen, but it is very important that the way in which we do that takes into account what it means for our biodiversity, because as you say, we're way off target. So we've definitely got to make sure that we don't say no to that kind of progress, because we need that energy, not least for our local industry, but also for the rest of the country. But we've got to do it in the right way. So we should be paying attention to that in the years ahead.
Thank you. Well within time. Next up, same question to Michael O'Carroll from the Liberal Democrats.
Well, I certainly do accept there's a biodiversity crisis. I think we'll hopefully all accept that on the panel here. The question then is obviously how to deal with that. And it's got so many different aspects, hasn't it? You'll have seen Liberal Democrat leader Ed Davey sort of falling off paddle boards and paddling in streams and getting wet very many times. And the reason for that is to draw attention to the particular concern we've had around the state of our rivers and seas and streams and lakes in the UK. Obviously, the huge amount of sewage overflows. And speaking of Swansea, the River Towy here is one of the most dumped into rivers in Wales, in the UK. And actually, that's despite having Dŵr Cymru as a not-for-profit company as well, although they have paid their directors quite a lot of money. And something we'd like to see, or something we're calling for, is no bonuses for water bosses when they're sewage dumping, which seems quite basic. But in terms of, we do need, in terms of that, we need a tough new sort of water regulator. We do need to have criminal sanctions, I think, for water company bosses if they're failing to manage their infrastructure properly. We'd like to see marine protected environments. Obviously, Torsten referenced the marine environment here and how that could be affected by the tidal lagoon, and I agree with him both in building the tidal lagoon and in needing the protections for the biodiversity. And then on land, you know, again, if we're talking sort of locally, something I'd draw attention to is the plans around Kilbay Hill, where, you know, we've got a restored environment that the local Labour Council are proposing plans that aren't sort of respecting that restored environment and that great asset we have sort of on our borders in Swansea. So, you know, we need to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. And I guess there's a lot of work to do across a whole range of areas, but that's some of the areas we'd like to tackle as Liberal Democrats, including here in Swansea.
Thank you very much. And next up, same question to Gwen Williams from Plaid Cymru.
Thank you. Well, nature and the climate emergency are two sides of the same coin, really. We have to tackle them both together because it's impossible to tackle one at a time. And this is something very close to Plaid's heart anyway, and it was instrumental, really, in pushing through at Senedd level the fact that Wales was the first UK Parliament to declare a nature and climate emergency, so that was an important thing. Plaid, to reference what Mike said before as well about don't look up, there is very much, we need science to fix this, and this is the case of perhaps don't look down or sideways. We have to look at our nature, both sideways and beneath us, and Plaid Cymru supports a science-led plan and is aligned with the 2022 Kunming-Montreal Agreement. And I'm not an ecologist and I'm not a biologist, so I don't know the details here. And likewise, you wouldn't want an ecologist running eye care in Wales. So likewise, I am not going to comment on the specifics of biodiversity, except to say that Plaid Cymru supports a science-based plan and targets as well. That we would halt decline by 2030 and ensure substantive recovery by 2050 by following the science. And I am not the proper type of scientist for this, but we believe in science and we know that we need to do this. 1 in 6 species in Wales is at risk of extinction within our lifetimes if we don't do this. This is an emergency and we need to deal with it, and Plaid Cymru is fully on board. One of the best things about our country is how beautiful and diverse it is. The Gower was the first area of outstanding natural beauty. We need to preserve that. Many of my colleagues have mentioned local things. I'll quickly reference Rhiannon and her plans to stop the building of houses in Singleton Park. And I agree with everything that's been said already. Well done for stopping the building of houses in Singleton Park.
Thank you very much. Next up, we have Patrick Benham-Crousel from Reform.
Yeah, excellent question. Yes, of course, it's a problem. It seems to me that the practical steps you can look at a habitat. All of biodiversity comes fundamentally from a habitat, be that the air, be that the sea, or be that the land. Air and air quality, as luck would have it, is perhaps being fixed by the net zero approach and the emissions crisis anyway, or at least it's being improved. There's a balance there between we have to make stuff and that will have emissions. Sea quality and water quality, well, we've seen Wales now actually has nitrogen vulnerable zones, so that might do a little bit to reduce the nitrification of the water layers. The water companies have behaved appallingly. That's just slack legislation and actually relatively easy to fix because it's just another piece of legislation with some teeth, which comes back to land. Farming, there's a balance between do you want to fertilise or do you want reduced yields? I mean, I'm young enough to remember when back in the 70s under the, when everyone was happily ripping out hedges. Well, I think those can all go back in. And there's a lot that can be done in the practice of agriculture to increase habitat for insects, which are the bottom of perhaps of the ecological chain, but they're also the most important part. That's going to impact on yields and the balance between what we farm and what we don't farm. I think there's a lot of potential for getting more diversity into pasture, rather than planting monoculture layers, letting it evolve, letting it develop, let the wildflowers develop. But most of all, I came back from Moldova. In Moldova, every street down the middle of it has plants. Those plants have insects, that supports birds, that's terrace, and somehow they get that done, and they've got a GDP per head that's less than half of what we have. So it's not really a money thing, it's an imagination thing.
Okay, thank you very much. Next up we have Gareth Bromhall from the Trade Union and Socialist Coalition.
Thank you, and thanks for the question, an interesting question there. I think when we're talking about biodiversity, we're talking locally about biodiversity. There's a couple of points I wanted to touch on really. One of them being the issue that we have with the sewage dumping. So I grew up in Pembrokeshire, in a fishing village in Pembrokeshire, and I now live in the sandfields just the other side of the city now. So I know sort of firsthand and foot actually if you're taking a dip in Swansea Bay, which wouldn't necessarily suggest that we do, particularly if you pay attention to some of the stuff that's come out, particularly from surfers against sewage on the dumping that's happened in the bay there in terms of the sewage in that way. I think that in order to prevent the catastrophic reality of the sewage dumping that we have in our waterways, in the rivers and into the sea is, again, I mentioned it before, but public ownership and control over the water companies, so that we can make sure that we have the control over how our water and how our sewage is managed. I think that's absolutely key. I did also want to mention the situation, with the question included the caveat about having sort of a local aspect, and I think I wanted to talk a little bit about the situation in Kilburn. The local community have been organising. There was a protest recently, 300 people to challenge the local Labour Council and the developers. We're talking about biodiversity. Concrete has a pretty devastating effect on biodiversity. And I think that the development that being planned for Kilburn Hill is definitely something that needs to be looked at and challenged in that way.
Thank you very much. Perfect timing. Thank you, Gareth. And then lastly for this question from the Green Party, we have Peter Jones.
Thank you to my wife for asking the question. I worked for the RSPB for 15 years as its Environment Policy Officer, with responsibility both for advising the RSPB on climate change and its effects on biodiversity, and also looking at biodiversity itself, particularly, of course, wild birds. And amongst the things I was responsible for, I was helped in the drafting of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act of 2015, particularly the section relating to resilience and biodiversity and climate change, and in 2016 to the Environment Act itself. And then subsequently, as a councillor for the Labour Party in those days, I held the council to account for the management of its responsibilities under the Environment Act. So I come from a pretty strong background. And I'm also, of course, a trustee for the Environment Centre here in Swansea. So this is my pet area, I suppose, with a minute left in which to say something about it. One thing that the Green Party is committed to doing is introducing what it will call a Rights of Nature Act, which will place responsibility, legal responsibility, on Parliament and on the councils and authorities across the country for protecting and enhancing nature. And indeed, as the Environment Act says, public bodies are now responsible for maintaining and enhancing biodiversity. And that's an important commitment, a legal commitment, but of course it's very difficult to deliver. As a councillor, I moved in 2021 the declaration of an emergency for biodiversity, global emergency for biodiversity. But of course it's very difficult for a council actually to deliver on that. But they do have strong responsibilities, and we'll endeavour to do so. Finally, of course, we are a marine city, and we've got a responsibility for coastal biodiversity, and we strongly support the creation of marine protection areas across the oceans.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much to all of our candidates. We'll move swiftly on now to the question about energy. Who in the room has the energy question? There at the back. Okay, we'd love to have your question. Thank you very much. Okay.
Will you legislate for clean energy, including wind and water, although excluding nuclear, and make it publicly owned, including the necessary infrastructure via the national grid?
Thank you for that question. First up in answering this time, we've got Michael O'Carroll on behalf of the Liberal Democrats.
Well, we wouldn't make energy publicly owned. That's not our policy. We think that what we do need is significant investment. But if you see, some of the very significant growth that we had in solar and wind power when we had the right subsidies back before 2015, before the sort of subsidies were cut back. We saw in that period a tripling in wind power. We saw a significant increase in the generation of solar by sort of small-scale solar projects on people's roofs. And what we need to do is invest in the big energy projects of the future, from the tidal lagoon through to things like the floating wind farm idea in the Celtic Sea, which has been quite well scoped out at the moment, but as far as I'm aware is awaiting investment. And there was a proposal from the Labour Party, you may remember, for £28 billion a year of green investment that got rowed back on. And actually I think that was a really good idea, and we need that level of investment in green energy to deliver what we need to do. I'm not quite sure what's sort of intended around your sort of comment or the question around legislation on green energy. I mean, clearly we'd like to move towards, we want to be at net zero by 2045, which we think is a very achievable target. I know that the Scottish Government have recently had to put back an unachievable target of theirs. And I don't know if that's the kind of legislation you're referring to, or if it's legislation specifically to close coal or oil plants or what have you. And I agree, I'm not a huge fan of nuclear energy. It could have been there in the medium term, but it leaves long-term risks around sort of nuclear toxic waste that doesn't degrade for potentially thousands or tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years. So I think we need massive investment in green energy. I'm not totally sure about what's meant by legislation. I don't think it needs to be in public ownership myself.
Okay, thank you. That's your time. Thank you very much. So next up, on behalf of Plaid Cymru, Gwyn Williams.
Thank you. I'll start with the nuclear aspect, as that's the easiest bit to answer, because Plaid Cymru opposes the development of new nuclear power stations and also new oil and gas drilling sites as well. So Plaid Cymru is quite clear on that aspect of things. With regards other aspects of the question, Plaid Cymru were pleased that Ynni Cymru got established, which is the Wales's own national energy company. And the key really is to expand that in order to expand community-owned renewable energy generation as well. I remember when I was young, I'm going off topic here now, which is a dangerous and a 2-minute question. When I was young, I lived in Rufawr at the top of the valley, and there was a plan there to build some wind turbines that were owned by the community of Rufawr and would help us with our bills. And it was a nice project that only took something like 20 years to get built. But it was a nice idea, and Ynni Cymru and Plaid Cymru are fully supportive of making these kinds of schemes infinitely easier to set up than they were in those days, because they were terrible. Also, we need, as I mentioned before, full control of the Crown Estate in Wales, the tidal area, the offshore area for the siting of wind turbines. They've got this in Scotland. 2017, Scotland got control of their Crown Estates. We still don't. We need control, and we need to be in control of all our assets. Also, to enact something called Section 48(1) of the Wales Act 2017, so we get full control over our water resources within Wales as well. We need control over everything, so we can... Oh, sorry, I interrupted the clap. Go ahead. I'll end on a high. Thank you, Dawn.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yep, ending on a high. Right, lovely. And the next up is Patrick Benham-Crousel from Reform on energy.
Great question, thank you. I wrote a book about this a while ago. The object, I'll send you a copy later. Right. The object of the exercise is simple. We need to keep the lights on, we need to get emissions down, and we need to be able to afford it. Here's the reality. 83% of the energy we currently use in this country comes from fossil fuels. Of the 17% that comes from electricity, only about half is green generated. If you wanted to get to 100% green electricity by 2030, in the next 4 years, you would have to build you'd have to double the number of wind turbines. And you'd have to be building them at twice the rate. This is a huge problem. How you get there is you find a balance. And how you determine that is largely engineering. I don't see that a way of doing it without a large amount of nuclear power, and I'm sorry if that upsets Plaid Cymru voters, but that's the way it is. And the other problem is with the intermittent renewables. It's not just generating it, it's storing it. You either have to build a huge number of batteries. I did the maths. If every house in the UK had a heat pump, every battery in the UK would keep those houses warm for 5 minutes. If you want to go for the hydro, then that's fine. Whose value are you going to block up? Dinorwig isn't used for energy storage, it's used for balances. It's a huge area that's needed. And money, and it is going to cost money. You can ask around the meetings I went to, National Grid and the like, saying this is at least £1 trillion, possibly double that. Well, the national debt's currently 3 trillion. It can be done because you can make profit out of it. Anyone can make a profit out of producing energy, but it's going to be very, very difficult and very, very slow.
Right,
there are no easy answers.
Okay, thank you very much. And next up, Gareth Brummel from TUSC.
Yes. Absolutely. And as part of a planned economy that meets the needs of us all, it's not geared towards profit. I think when we're looking at this, I think the distinction about nuclear is really important. I don't think nuclear has a place in the transition that we need to green energy, and it's definitely something that we as the Trade Union Treasurers Coalition do not support in that way. Nationalised infrastructure is absolutely key to doing this. We talked about the energy companies, absolutely. Bringing them into public ownership and making sure that the planning of energy and the planning of infrastructure on a national scale is done to meet our needs in that way. Legislation, I think that definitely plays a part, but if you've got democratic control over those organisations, they're going to be the ones that are going to be making the changes themselves, so I think that's definitely an important aspect of that. Democratic workers' control is going to be absolutely key in terms of making that transition. And I think, when we're talking about the transition that needs to happen and the need to move towards a green economy, by having that aspect of public ownership, I think it'll mean that when we're looking at moving away from these industries, there's issue going on at the moment. Unite members in the North Sea are mounting a campaign because of the plans to completely shut off any new oil and gas exploration and that sort of thing. What we need to be doing is bringing those workers with us. We can't just say that we're going to shut off these industries and leave those communities and those workers out in the cold. You need to look at plans like the Lucas Plan and the way that we can take industry that is polluting, an industry that is damaging the planet, and take those workers and democratically move towards a production that is beneficial to the planet and beneficial to their communities. And I think that that's what's missing a little bit sometimes in these conversations.
Okay, thank you very much. And next up from the Green Party, Peter Jones.
Thank you. The privatisation of energy, like the privatisation of water, is a disgrace, an absolute disgrace. And we've seen the consequences of privatisation in terms of the effects on the profitability of global companies making billions at our expense, as we saw it with the water companies as well. You'll gather from that, I would bring the energy companies back into public ownership as quickly as possible as an essential first step. Also, like my friend from the Pride, we're totally opposed to nuclear energy and would act very quickly to stop all nuclear developments. Not only are they dangerous, but they're ridiculously expensive, subject to long delays, and probably will never deliver within the time frame of combating climate change. So they're a complete waste of money and a complete waste of space and time. They're also, incidentally, dangerous in terms of missile attack. It'd be very easy to lob a few missiles onto our nuclear power stations, and the consequences are too frightening to consider. They're totally opposed to nuclear. The Green Party is totally committed, of course, to wind, to solar, and to tidal forms of energy. Indeed, when I worked for the RSPB, sorry to go on about the RSPB, but when I worked for the RSPB, I worked on the 7 barrows over a number of years. Of course, that hasn't still seen the light of day. And when I were talking about coastal lagoon across the bay in Swansea, of course, we would support that strongly and would fund it appropriately. There's been a problem, of course, with feeding from renewable energy sources into the national grid, and that's got to be addressed urgently. It's no good producing lots of wind stations in the North Sea if they can't be connected into the national grid, and there have been enormous delays in doing that, so that has to be rectified as a matter of course. So to sum up, public ownership, yes; nuclear, no; renewables as quickly as possible and as fast as possible. We can support, we've got a target, 70% of electricity by 2030 from wind power.
Okay, and finally for this question on energy, Torsten Bell from Labour.
Thank you very much indeed. So this is probably the thing where the Labour Party manifesto has the most to say, and the reason it has the most to say, unlike previous elections, is because this is the challenge for the 2020s, because we're trying to do something absolutely huge, which is obviously decarbonise our electricity generation as it stands today, but also to move to using electricity for powering huge numbers of other things like heating our homes and driving our cars. So the challenge is, as we've set out, very hard. On top of that, if we remain in a higher interest rate environment, then remember this is a big investor save project, right? That's what net zero is actually about. Huge investment in decarbonising our infrastructure, upfront costs associated with that, whether it's public or private actually, madam, but high upfront costs, and then savings and a cleaner planet from doing that. That's what we're all engaged in the business of doing, and we've got to move past that theory to what do we actually do to make this happen. So what the manifesto sets out is a plan to, within the first few months of a new Labour government, put £8.3 billion into establishing Great British Energy, the role of which is to invest in hydrogen, tidal power, hopefully tidal power in places like us, so that we're able to harness our natural abilities. 3.3 billion of that will go into a local power plan to let the Great British Energy partner with local communities, so there is shared interest and ownership of those power generation. And that is how we start doing that. But there's then other huge challenges. The grid, as you've rightly pointed out, is a very, very significant challenge, probably the biggest constraint currently on our ability to roll out renewable energy. Lots of the problems actually aren't here. They're in England, where we had, obviously, you'll have seen the basic ban on onshore wind, the cheapest form of energy, and that's holding us all back because we all share the same electricity. But we've got to sort that, even for our own interests. So, I can go on. But all I would say is, I started out in politics working for a man called Ed Miliband, who will be the Energy Secretary if there is a Labour government, and you will decide that's what you want to vote for. I've never met anyone as committed to making sure we actually get on with delivering. It may not have always been good for him, actually, in his political career to be as committed to it. Things will happen.
Okay. Thank you very much. Right, we'll move straight on to the next question, which will be the food and farming question. So who in the room has the food and farming question? Yes, here in the front. Thank you.
I expect some immediate complaints from a couple of people. So can I just preface saying I am a environmental scientist at Yale University and a former senior DEFRA advisor working in this very area. Now, given the undeniable impact of livestock agriculture on the climate and ecological emergency, how will you, or your party, help reduce meat consumption in the UK?
Interesting question there. Thank you very much for that. And up first this time is Gwyn Williams from Plaid Cymru.
Thank you. Plaid Cymru is very much on the side of sustainable farming generally, and recognises that changes to the way we farm are, whilst maintaining the institution of farming in Wales, is sacrosanct in preserving our culture as well, as so many of Wales's language, his institution, his culture is tied up in farming. But you're quite right. We can't carry on with the way that we are at the moment, and I fully admit that my diet, as a person myself, could be a lot healthier than it is, and I should be listening to my wife there with regards healthier eating and eliminating more meat. This is true. It is a cultural thing, and we need to be healthier as a country as well. Obviously, I'm slightly biased because, and I don't mean to go off topic here, I deal with diabetic retinopathy in work as my day job, and there's been an explosion of diabetic retinopathy over the past few years caused by unhealthy eating, bad diet, and as my wife constantly tells me as well, a poor person's diet is a bad diet, and that is the issue. When you go to Tesco's and you go to the shops, the food that's healthy for you is cripplingly expensive compared to low-cost meat that, due to Brexit and various other things, has been imported cheaply from abroad without any proper controls, and that is flooding our market. So we have to think of it in terms of the whole world as well, although we're specifically talking about Swansea West, that we need to change the way we are as a people and as a culture, and that doesn't come easy, but we need to start the hard work. But whilst taking our farmers along with us for the journey.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Next up from Reform, we've got Patrick Benham-Crousel.
Okay, full disclosure, I used to spend 25 years living on a dairy farm and then a beef farm. I don't like telling people what to do, which is funny because I used to be an army officer. And I don't think it will work to tell everyone, no, we're going to cut your meat. I think what we should do is label properly. We should go to the supermarkets and get them to sort out their labelling in a way that is comprehensible. And they will say it's too difficult, but everyone on this panel knows getting stuff printed quickly at short notice can be done. The second point is that actually there's probably nowhere on the planet better for the dairy industry, and with dairy you get beef, than South West Wales, a distant relative farmed at Stackpole and won everything. And if climate change is a global problem, biodiversity is a global problem, so is feeding people. And if we have a country that is capable of producing high quality protein, it seems to me to perverse not to produce it to feed the people who are otherwise be trying to come here to feed because they live in the Sahel. So, like everything, I'm going to cop out and say there's no easy answer, but it seems to me, as a supplementary, putting a solar panel on top of some of the most productive farmland in the world, which is currently going on in Lincolnshire, is ridiculous. We need to get grown up about this, educate the public, and force commercial interests to be upfront and honest about what they do. Within the actual agriculture, yes, there's things that can be done to improve processes. They can put in anaerobic digesters which turn what would be free methane into actually a useful biofuel, and this, that and the other, but that's not the real point. It's coming at this from educating the public. They will make informed choices, and any business follows what its customers want or they go bust.
Okay, that's your time. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. And moving straight on to Gareth Bromhall from Tusk.
Thank you. Interesting question, absolutely. I think one of the main things that we need to do is, and it was something I was in my introduction about to go on to before my 2 minutes was up, was to move away from sort of high intensive farming practices. We've got mega farms where the pollution that comes out of them is absolutely horrendous. Where there are in Wales we've got as Gwyn said, we've got a fantastic tradition of farming, and it was sustainable in its practices in the way that it was done. I think if we're looking at the impact of meat on our diet, and as was talked about, you know, the sheer fact that so many people are forced to eat such high processed food, and meat plays quite a large part in the sort of high processed food that people do take, is because of the situation we find ourselves, the cost of living crisis, the fact that we live under a capitalist system where people are absolutely forced to make those choices, or the choices taken away from them even because they can't afford to make those choices in terms of how to eat. I think I just wanted to touch on, you know, if we're talking about, you know, informing people and we're talking about getting people into looking at the diet and how we do that, I think one of the really important ways to do that is through public health and health communication. I'm an NHS worker myself, and I see the real effects that poor diet and meat consumption plays a part of that on the general public. But we face a situation in Wales where the NHS is absolutely on its knees. The ambulance service, I work for the ambulance service, are on our knees. The A&Es are absolutely full, and the situation means that things like health education and health communication are sometimes the first things to be cut and the first thing to be affected by those cuts. So I think that we need to be making sure.
I really appreciate how polite everyone is being about the time. Thank you so much. Next up then from the Green Party, Peter Jones.
Thank you. Wales is a curious country. 3 million people and 10 or 11 million sheep. This tells you something about the importance of agriculture across our economy. I'm a vegetarian, and my wife is a vegan, and I'm trying very hard to become a vegan. And I'll tell you why. It's an issue of health in terms of humans. All the research evidence seems to point towards vegetarian and vegan diets being healthier than meat-based diets, particularly red meat diets, of course. I've been a vegetarian for, 25 or more years now. And not only, of course, for human health, but also for animal welfare. I worked for a week, I don't tell you, only a week, in a pork canning factory in Swindon in Wiltshire, and I heard the screams of live pigs being slaughtered. It's a disgusting habit. Meat eating needs to be reduced, and reduced dramatically. And also, of course, there are environmental implications in terms of the impact of livestock farming, in particular on biodiversity and so forth, particularly as we've seen in other parts of the world, in the Amazon and so forth. So reduce meat, and to do it, we can only do it by education. People need to understand and know the consequences to their own health and to the treatment of animals and others from eating meat. This word meat in itself is a kind of movement away from life. It doesn't conjure up an image of a living creature. It suggests something that's inanimate and so forth. And people are going to start thinking, meat, that was once a living, sentient creature. Think about that. It could be you or I, if we were sort of in a different species. It's an appalling practice. So no to meat eating, and I think education is the way to do it. And in terms of the role of agriculture, 10% of UK emissions are from agriculture, and they principally from livestock farming. So the more that can be done to reduce that, the better. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And now from Labour, Torsten Bell.
Great. Well, I thought maybe you should just go back into government. And if you can take your job back up again, then you can go and help. This isn't what politicians normally do, but why don't we talk about why it's difficult for a second, and then come on to, because broadly you've heard the same answer from everyone, right, which is more education would be a good idea. I think that definitely would. My 11-year-old daughter is a rather active vegetarian. So she's waging her propaganda campaign across our household and anyone else you can get a hold of, and that will make a difference in time, but it may be slower than you'd like to see. So why is that what you're getting told by all of us, rather than what some people would like to propose, meat taxes or the rest? And that's because it's hard, because we're not on track. We're not remotely on track in terms of emission reductions in general from farming. You've raised one particular issue, which is on meat consumption, but it's not the only one. If we look at that, and you can see that because you've heard again from people on the panel who want to say they want to see lots of progress, but want to tell you that farmers shouldn't have to do very much about it. Okay, so that's what you normally see in these kind of debates. But there's another reason why it's difficult, and that's because food prices are up 30% in the last 2 years. Food bank queues are up 37%. 11% of children are going without at least one meal a week in schools in Britain, compared to 2.6% in Portugal, a far poorer country. So we should be careful about saying we are going to willy-nilly do anything that pushes up prices of food, because there's nothing more essential than food. We've all focused on energy for the last few years, understandably, because prices have gone up, but food is a bigger problem for poor households in Britain right now. So we have to do this in the right way. And because in the end, as I said to you right at the beginning, our task here is to decarbonise this economy, to make it cleaner and grow faster, but do it in a way that keeps people with us, because this can go wrong. This can definitely go wrong. And because everyone in this room more or less agrees, we might think this can go, if only everybody just embraced this and got on with it. That is not what this is going to... We're going to be living through this for the next 3 decades, and we've got to keep the population with us. And I promise you, food prices, if we care about making sure that we're not a country with high poverty rates, matter a lot.
Okay, thank you very much. And now Michael O'Carroll from the Liberal Democrats.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's an advantage or disadvantage of going last, but I was going to take my answer in a slightly similar direction to Torsten, which is just to look at the, if we want to reduce high methane output livestock, so particularly cattle and sheep, there's several different ways we could do that. One would be to ban it, one would be to ration it, one would be to raise the prices, which would be kind of price rationing, and one would be to provide alternatives. Now, I'm a Liberal. I don't wish to tell people what to do. That's where I share with Patrick that I wouldn't go down the banning route or the rationing route. So that leaves us with raising the prices, which is kind of the implication, actually, of both, to some extent, of the policies that the Liberal Democrats put forward for, say, high welfare standards and for setting aside greater parts of farmland for fallow and wetlands and other environmental concerns. Which is incidentally the route that Welsh Labour are going down in the Senate through their sustainable farming scheme. Hasn't been implemented terribly well, but is a broadly good idea. The other thing that we can do, and that we absolutely should do, is investigate alternative proteins, whether that's lab grown, whether that's insects, whether that's other things that are less methane intensive protein, and including, by the way, the sort of kind of vegan alternatives and the sort of fake meats and stuff like that, although it does come with a lot of sort of strange ingredients jammed together at the moment, but there is potential there, and it is something we need to look at. And on that note, the Liberal Democrats would establish a dedicated research fund, a research and innovation fund, specifically to support emerging technology and the development of alternative proteins, which long term I think is probably the way that we kind of get out of this high protein or this high methane producing livestock. We do have to get there. Agree with that. It's very difficult. I agree.
Okay, so I think that's everybody on the food and farming question. On to housing. Who has the housing question?
Yeah,
Great. Yes, please, Alice.
right. Sorry. Okay, so our group started from the point that shelter is a basic human need, because we all need a roof over our head. But we also thought that as well as providing that shelter, there's no reason why good quality housing shouldn't be imaginative and exciting. So bearing that in mind, our question is, if you are elected, what will you and your party do to ensure sustainable, environmentally friendly and affordable homes for all generations? We're ambitious, okay?
Brilliant. Great question, thank you very much. And taking this first from Reform, we have Patrick Benham-Crousel. No time to think. Thank you.
I'm feeling like a bit of a in a time warp here, because after I ran a farm, I ran a brickworks. Okay, there's 23 million odd houses in the UK. The housing stock median age is about 75, and about 10 or 15% of them are over 100 years old. That is, they were built and designed for an economy that ran on coal. They got converted to coal gas, then got converted to natural gas, and now we're asking them to do heat pumps. It's difficult. It's really difficult. And that means we've got two problems. One, we've got ever increasing population, so we've got to build new stuff. Building new exciting stuff shouldn't be as hard as people are making it look. I mean, some of the developments are very, very unoriginal. but you can do them, you can make them sustainable. Obviously, you've got to consider the biodiversity. There's going to be decisions made when we get to transport about, does every house need a drive, or could it have a bigger garden? Should we have decking? Should we have flower beds? You know, that's pretty straightforward. The problem is retrofitting and bringing the old housing stock up to a sustainable standard. And that is not cheap. When they converted from coal gas to natural gas, most of the housing stock was relatively freshly bought post-Second World War, but it was to a standard size, so they could literally run down the street and do the whole lot in a day. You can't do that now. And whether you go for heat pumps or whether you go for hydrogen, it's not just changing the fuel. There's a likelihood that you'll have to change the actual heating inside the house, and that then, you know, imagine having your boiler and all your radiators ripped out and put more in. It takes time. Currently, we're doing about 60,000 houses a year with heat pumps. It's nowhere near enough. It'll take 400 years to get it done. Other things we could do on sustainability.
Okay, that's your time.
Someone else will have to tell you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Keen to keep moving on. Over to Gareth from Tusk.
Thank you so much. I think, you know, I absolutely agree, shelter is an absolute fundamental human right, and it's something that we need to take on and really tackle. You know, there are huge swathes of people who are stuck in a housing stock that's unfit for habitation. I lived in Swansea for a couple of years in the private rented sector, and the sheer scale of housing that's just not fit for people to live in is massive. It's an issue in Swansea, it's an issue in Swansea West, but it's an issue nationally. I think, you know, one of the things that we need to be looking at is you know, a programme of the mass building of social housing. You know, social housing that meets the needs of our communities and the local environment that is around them, and not for profit. As you know, the amount of private housing that's being made at the moment on the cheap. You know, you see these new estates that are built without schools, without local community connections, that are built, you know, and they're falling down before the doors open type thing. You know, it's a scandal really that people pay hundreds of thousands of pounds for a house that you know isn't going to last. And that's why I think, you know, the building of social housing, the building of new communities is really important. But you can't just, you know, build an estate with a private road and leave it there. You need to build a community around that. You need to build the schools. You need to build the hospitals. You need to build the infrastructure that's needed to support those people's needs. Because it's not just shelter when we're looking at housing. It is that sort of part that you have in society and the community that surrounds you. So I think, you know, yes, we need to make sure that the housing stock grows, and yes, we need to make sure that people are living in environmentally friendly and in safe homes. But that can't be done by handing billions to private companies. We need to be doing that under democratic control.
Okay, thank you. Peter Jones from the Green Party.
Thank you. There are 1 million households on council waiting lists. 1 million households. You can convert that in terms of the size of a household, and potentially talking about 4 million people, adults and children. That's an appalling statistic in a supposedly wealthy country that we have to consider. Moreover, when you look at the housing market, first of all the private sector market, it's something like 8.3, the cost of a house is something like 8.3 times the average wage or salary. That's an appalling statistic. Again, when I was somewhat younger, it was about 3 times. Now it's 8.5 times, an appalling consideration. We need new, affordable, sustainable houses, as the questioner has rightly drawn attention to. That means they've got to be fit for climate change. They've got to be fit for rising temperatures, heavy rainstorms, and so forth. I live in a terrace house, built I think about 1905. Patrick talking about older housing. It is a problem, and that there are millions of us living in older properties. And the idea of renovating us up to the kind of levels that are being suggested is rather frightening to consider. with the Green Party, we're committed to building 150,000 new council properties, affordable properties, and council properties per year. And that's an essential target to set for ourselves. We also are committed to ending the right to buy, which is taking away public housing and giving it to the private sector. We're also committed to introducing powers to local authorities to introduce rent controls, long overdue, to stop the disgusting habits of landlords just raising the rents time and time again. And we would end no-fault eviction. In other words, we're concerned about people who rent as well as people who don't buy. Thank you.
Next up, Torsten Bell from Labour.
Thank you very much. So I'm boring. I'm a bread and butter social democrat. I'm about good jobs, getting houses built, and saving the planet, as we've been discussing for most of today. And that does mean building a lot more houses. And we've all told you that here, although we should be honest, politicians across Britain and lots of us as individuals often oppose homes being built regularly. We see that everywhere. We see that from members of all political parties. And if that isn't going to change, that doesn't change, we are not going to solve this problem. And what we will have is people sitting comfortably in homes they own while the next generation comes through and can't afford not just to buy, but can't afford to pay their rent. So we should start with, we're not doing enough job. Here in Swansea, we've got 8,000 people on the waiting list. The national figures are terrifying too, but that's how many we have on our waiting list. We are not close to meeting what we need to do. If we look at the national level, the picture's terrifying. So what does not building enough homes for year after year after year look like? Well, it looks like now, average home in Britain being smaller, in all of Britain, so not in London, in Britain, is now smaller than the average home in New York. Okay, that shouldn't be possible, right? And that is where we have ended up, people squashed into smaller homes because we've opposed building or we haven't done it, and the government has definitely not done enough when it comes to social housing. We need to see a big start in that, and that is what is pushing up housing costs. Forget the ownership ratios, right? The earnings to housing prices. That matters for ownership, okay? But what matters for people is rent and how high their housing costs are relative to earnings. And those have gone through the roof for lower families. They used to spend about 10% of their income on housing. It's now over 30%. If you're poor and renting in the private sector, it can be easily 50% on average in richer parts of the country. You can only deal with that. Yes, the government's subsidising it at the moment, but we need to build more homes over time. Now, if we look at what's happening in Swansea, we can see the council spending £500 million on the Welsh housing quality standard, making progress and upping but it's also got some progress on higher end products, which we should look at, and hopefully other places will learn from.
Okay, that's your time. Thank you, Torsten. And I believe Torsten now has to make his apologies because he's in a Zoom meeting.
Thank you very much, everyone. It's lovely to see you all.
Thank you for being here.
See you later in the campaign.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks to everyone else for sticking with us. We're going to cover one more topic area, which is transport. But before that, we've got two more housing responses. And the first of those is from Michael O'Carroll from the Liberal Democrats.
Well, I've been looking forward to this one because it's quite good. It's a really strong part of the Liberal Democrat manifesto. Our commitments on house building are very similar to some of the figures that you mentioned. We'd like to build 380,000 homes a year, including exactly the same figure as the Green Party, actually, 150,000 social homes a year. But I think that the key point that's come up in the discussion and that we need to build the right homes. And if you look at a lot of the sites that are being built at the moment, you see these sort of identikit sprawling suburban estates, don't you, with relatively large houses. And when I go round, all the time, I'm talking to people who are looking for either they're older people looking to downsize and the housing stock isn't there, or they're young people looking to get on the ladder and get their first, get a flat or a small apartment or something like that. We're building completely the wrong type of homes. And if you look at, the city centre of Swansea, say, we've got this sprawling, rundown retail area. We need to change some of that to housing stock, and we need to build up. Like, I live on St Helens Road. We could be building higher there. You go to Paris, you go to Berlin, we're sort of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 stories. Here, we're stuck to a couple, and if we don't want to, we've got to expand the housing stock without concreting over the entire countryside and doing all the problems with biodiversity that we've been talking about. And we've got to build the right type of homes, and that's what the Liberal Democrats would do. We would also legislate immediately that every new home built has to be zero carbon standard. and we would have a massive programme of retrofitting insulation and heat pumps in the old stock, and we've got the money, we've put aside a huge amount of money to pay for that. We're talking about raising or changing the capital gains tax infrastructure, increasing taxes on banks, on social media companies, and on share buybacks. Some of that money is going to the NHS and social care, but a lot of it is being set aside for our housing sort of retrofit project. And if, oh, sorry, I've run out of time.
Thank you for being so polite. And next up, Gwyn Williams from Plaid Cymru.
Thank you, and I share Mike's sadness at going last that he mentioned last time, because many of the things that I would have mentioned have been mentioned already. But I will say, I will agree with my Tusk colleague at the end there, that the basic problem here is that housing, instead of being a basic human need, has become an asset class and also an investment. And people buy multitudes of houses for investment, and that pushes up prices of the remaining housing stock for those that are there, and pushes up rent as well. And this is a vicious cycle that Plaid Cymru is viscerally against. Plaid Cymru believes, as do many of my colleagues, that housing is a basic human right, and would support an increase in social housing to make up for that. And it can be done, for it's been done in the past, and all of this difficulties now. My grandparents lived in Green Hill, and they moved up to Gendros just as soon as it was built, all the new houses up there, which was regarded as the bee's knees back in the day after the war. But there was a time when we built many, many houses, and we housed the people of Swansea in a city that had been bombed and destroyed in the war, and we can do that again. It is within our power to do that, and Plaid Cymru supports sustainable housing for people, social housing, and to end the cycle of investment by people. I mean, I know this, before my 2 minutes runs out, I'll say quickly, I'm going to bring Hounslow into this, because Hounslow is like Swansea on steroids, really. That every time they build a new block of flats or anything like that, 99% of the houses are bought by investors, sometimes from overseas, sometimes from the city, before anyone else can get their hands on. This is what we need to break. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's everybody on housing. So who has the question on transport for us next? Brilliant. Thank you.
It's got a lot of words in it, so I'm really slow. What will be your approach to achieving an equitable, efficient and sustainable public transport system given current economic conditions, legislation and domination of motor vehicles?
Thank you very much for that question. And Gareth Brummel from Tusk, it's your turn to go first.
Thank you. Thankfully, I didn't need too much preparation for this question. I'm going to say it again. We need to own our public transport system, absolutely. You know, I've been on picket lines over the past couple of years with the train drivers and with the rail staff who are striking to keep the trains safe and to keep the infrastructure in place. There's a huge issue at the moment where, you know, the drive towards the privatisation of rail, which has been an absolute disaster, has meant that, you know, and the current government and the position they have has meant that, you know, they're absolutely slashing the safety on the trains, and I worry that it'll take another another disaster for them to start taking rail safety seriously. It's a shame that Trostman's had to leave there. You know, the position that's been put forward by the Labour Party on nationalisation of the railway is something that they're making a big deal about. But what's being put forward, you know, the likelihood of a Labour government, I think, is fairly certain at this stage. But what they're putting forward, the idea of bringing franchises in-house when they run out, isn't going to be enough. We need to, day one, nationalise the railways. We need to nationalise the bus services and all of the infrastructure in that way, so that we can start running in a way that meets the community's needs. Like I said, grew up in rural Pembrokeshire, and there are huge swathes of rural Wales that just aren't met by public transport because they've been cut and cut and cut. and the deserts. You know, the banks are being ripped away from them. The public transport's been ripped away from them. So if you don't have a car, then you can't live in those communities. So what means that people who can't afford to live there because the housing stock is too expensive and can't afford to get out of them either. You know, it's definitely something we need to do. Public ownership all the way.
Thank you very much. And now to Peter Jones from the Green Party.
Thank you again. Well, this is a climate meeting. It's worth noting that transport is responsible for something like 25% of emissions in the UK. And that's a frightening statistic and something we need to do something about. Moreover, transport, particularly private cars, are responsible for high levels of air pollution. If you live outside a school, as I do, you can experience the consequences for yourself. There's something like the figures are between 29,000 and 40,000 deaths annually in the United Kingdom from air pollution. And that's another frightening statistic to consider. But yes, in terms of ownership, the Green Party would bring both rail and bus transport back into public ownership, again as quickly as possible. Transport is a public right, and we shouldn't have to depend upon private providers to meet that particular need. We've all seen, I suspect, in Swansea, the consequences of private ownership, in particular of buses, and the cuts in provision and so forth. I don't drive, by the way. I took a decision at the age of 16, not to drive because I could see the consequences, even then, decades ago, of emissions from private cars. So yes, we would bring, as I say, public transport back into real public ownership. And the Green Party has set a target that by 2035, we want to see an end to all petrol and diesel transport on the roads. Not just new cars, but all cars, because they're obviously a major problem. We also fully support the 20 mile per hour speed limit that the Welsh Government rightly introduced. And that's responsible in particular for protecting public health. I mentioned the consequences of air pollution, and by bringing down the speed limit, not only will we make roads safer in terms of air pollution, but we'll also make them safer in terms of accidents. So that's our position.
Thank you very much. Okay, and we'll come next then to Michael O'Carroll from the Liberal Democrats.
Well, there's two things I want to particularly focus in on this one. The first one is buses. Liberal Democrat conferences are sick of me talking about buses, so you can be too. And the reason is because, you know, we've got this romance of rail, and everyone talks about railways, and there's nothing wrong with railways, but they are quite expensive. We're never going to be able to expand them in a massive way. And if we want, you know, the question was about equitable public transport. Buses are kind of, they're really where that's at. And if you go around, again, talking to people across the city of Swansea, the bus cuts that we've had over the last few years in terms of the routes, quite aside from the price increases, have really affected a huge number of people. And in the same month, last summer, that the Welsh Government was talking about a modal shift to public transport, the funding to bus companies was cut. And you can't have, you know, that's not a thing that goes together. So in terms of where bang for a buck is, more bang for your buck, something like that, it's in the buses. And we would subsidise as well free bus travel for 16 to 18 year olds, and also a sort of young person's bus card to get younger people onto our buses and mobile. And the other thing I just want to say is that we're never going to get rid of private motor cars. I did a lot of work when I was working at the uni in trying to support the team there in trying to get people to travel by public transport, and there's things you can do and more people will, but people are really, really psychologically attached to their private motor vehicles, and part of what we have to do is get the technological advancement and get the regulations in place to make those less environmentally harmful, because the idea that we'll get away with private motor cars altogether, particularly in rural areas, is just not going to happen. So we've got to do both the public transport side and, you know, the improving the private motor vehicle side.
Thank you very much. And next up, Gwyn Williams from Plaid Cymru.
Thank you. I share many of my colleagues' thoughts, and Plaid Cymru does as well, about renationalising bus and rail services to properly integrate things. I walked the Wales Coast Path over the past few years, and one of the things I noticed is that although public transport is suffering in Swansea West, and in Swansea generally, on some parts of the Llŷn Peninsula and some other areas, the public transport is appalling. I was waiting for a bus, the time went, and then it turns out there's only a bus on a Thursday or something like this. This isn't a way to run a country, and if you live in those districts, then it's completely impossible that you go to town on a Tuesday and come back on a Thursday. What's the use of this? We have to renationalise in order to promote these routes, which are otherwise unprofitable, but it is a way to run a country, and otherwise no one can get anywhere. People who cannot drive, people who cannot see to drive. We'd be doing our rural community a disservice. The people of Swansea West have suffered because of the cuts in bus services, but people elsewhere have also suffered quite a bit more. To come back to rail transport though, and I was going to tell Torsten Bell off and the Labour Party, because Keir Starmer has not committed to return the £4 billion that the Westminster government took from us for funding HS2, which doesn't even go 1 inch into railways. I would have told off the Conservative if they had been here, because they've underfunded our railways to the tune of £500 million anyway over the past few years, and I would have gone like this. But Dawn was quite clear that we were against violence in this place. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you very much. And last on transport then, from Reform, Patrick Benham-Crousel.
Okay, a memory, i.e. when I was 21, so 40 years ago, we used to bring our tanks down to go and play soldiers at Castle Martin just by Fishguard, Pembroke Dock. And we were told then that the railway line was going to be electrified in the next decade, and it still hasn't been, and I just lose the will to live. And how hard can it be? The question's about economic and sustainable public transport, so I won't bang on about my day job, which is driving an HGV1. It's very difficult. To make it sustainable, you're obviously going to have to get rid of the internal combustion engines. Easy-ish to do in the city centre because you just go for trolley buses, which again, everyone in the world except the UK seems to be able to do, and I'm pretty sure we invented them. As close to car usage, if you made everyone have an electric car to be sustainable, that would be another 3 sizable Cs or equivalent wind farms that you need in electricity. I think we're going to have to work our way to an environment in which people don't need a car. And a car is a horribly expensive thing to own, and all it does is sit there, depreciate, and then break down. That's it. And occasionally it crashes, or someone crashes their car into you. It's never one's own fault. And the only way that's going to happen is if we get much smarter and much wiser and enable buses to fill the gap. I don't see much more in the way of building major train lines. I think electrifying what we got, increasing the capacity on what we got, sorting out the safety is all perfectly possible. I've avoided party political points, but it is the fact that we'll stop HS2, the programme that solved the problem that no one ever had of getting to Birmingham from London 20 minutes quicker. How do you make it economic? Well, I think this is I'm a die-hard capitalist, but parts of the country and parts of society rely on infrastructure being there, and I don't much care who owns it, but if there's a bus, it needs to work and it needs to be affordable. If that's subsidy or if that's... I'll shut up.
Thank you very much. Right, I think that actually brings us to the end of our questions and our answers. And I would just like to say thank you very much to all of the candidates for being at least willing to engage in the conversation this evening, to be here to represent your parties and to represent your views. And thank you for being the people who have stood up to stand up for your values in the upcoming election. Thank you very much from all of us in the room. And thank you to all of you. Thank you to all of you for such thoughtful questions, co-created so well in your breakout groups. What a fantastic way to organise a hustings, and well done very much to Swansea Climate Action Network for pulling this evening's event together. I've been really delighted to be your human stopwatch for the evening, and I hope I've done that justice and kept us more or less to time. Thank you all, and good night.